Sarah, thank you so much for that kind introduction. Good morning, everyone. I can say good morning because it is morning in America, which is where I am right now, and that's why I have an excess of sunshine coming through this window. I'm really pleased to be able to talk to you today about the situation in global supply chains, and particularly the exclusion of women and where that is coming out after the pandemic. Some of you will be aware that there was a fairly considerable effort to better include women in supply chains during the previous 10 years before the pandemic began. And now both informal and formal data that are coming out in the aftermath show that that effort has taken a considerable hit. Some of the institutional players who were previously trying to play a reform role, such as some of the leading corporations, have pulled back now. And those who were the target of reform, particularly the banks, have gone back to their old exclusionary ways. Gender stereotypes are playing a role in this backsliding by offering rationales to those who are weak-willed or intransigent. Three of them that I have heard with regard to procurement are, for example, well, it's last in, first out. You know, that's the rule. And since the women were last in, they're the first out. Now, this is taking advantage of a common mantra in accounting that has to do with accounting for inventory. But it is often generalized then as kind of a handy excuse for what is happening in the economy, particularly to women. Ever since women were first beginning to come into the labor force, for example, and in significant numbers, whenever there was any kind of a downturn, the women would be let go, and the argument was, oh, last in, first out. This is the kind of thing that we simply need to learn to call out. We need to learn not to accept it as simply a rule of the universe, the way business is done. It's not. It's an easy to mimic rule that most people don't question, and so businesses can get away with it. Another thing that I'm hearing is that funds are being moved to things that are more important. In particular, moving to climate change. This was already a problem before the pandemic, and the thinking under this is sometimes articulated, but usually left unspoken. Nevertheless, is motivational, and that is to say that, well, you know, we need to be putting our money and our efforts against important causes like climate change and not unimportant causes like including women in the economy. Again, I think it's important, although it's tricky, to learn to push back on these kinds of things. It is not the case that women are unimportant to either the economy or climate. And there is nothing about excluding women and holding them subordinate that is going to help save the planet. So this is a false dichotomy that we need to learn to blow apart whenever we hear it. The thing that I hear, though, that is the most compelling and the one that I think is the most true is something that I heard from a Financial Times journalist early in the pandemic. And he said to me, well, what I'm hearing is that, you know, helping women business owners is not really necessary. It's a nice to have, but it's not a must have. Whereas helping men's own businesses is necessary in order to keep the economy going and get it back on track. Now, this idea that women are not necessary grows out of a kind of blindness where we don't understand how important to the world economy and to world society that women's economic participation is. It grows out of the fact, and I've explained this in my book, it grows out of the fact that women's contribution has not been counted because we only count what is monetized. It grows out of the fact that women have been actively, structurally excluded from economic participation for much of human history. This allows us to think that women are not important even when we are, and that means then that policymakers are likely simply to have a blind spot that doesn't allow them to look at gender and to look at what could be gained by helping women and what will be lost if they are not assisted in a gender appropriate way. So for example, at the moment, roughly 40% of GDP globally is contributed by women. Women have, at this point, very nearly an equal role economically with men as far as labor goes. but their impact on the global economy is magnified because of their role in cultivating human capital. In other words, their role in raising children. In addition, because in most countries at this point, women make all the consumer decisions, virtually all, 75% plus, in some countries as much as 85%. Women are important to getting any economy on track and helping it remain stable and to thrive, because they're the ones that make sure children are fed, that people are educated, that they get the health care that they need, all of which are essential inputs to the modern economy. What we see also is, however, at this point, is that excluding women causes a lot of very negative impacts. So, for example, keeping women out of land ownership and keeping them away from a full and equal participation in the production of the food supply contributes to food insecurity, conflict, even war. In addition, not allowing women to have equal access to economic participation encourages disease and reduces access to health care for both women and children. One thing that I do want to call attention to for this group in particular, and especially if you are involved in policy, is that I was fortunate to be asked by USAID recently to do a complete review of the literature and to write about the causal influence that gender inequality has on poverty. We can now say with finality that gender inequality is a structural global factor that actually causes as well as perpetuates poverty. It's not a symptom of poverty, it's a cause. And anyone who would like to look into that, I would encourage you to Google gender inequality causes poverty. It will come up. Unfortunately, I had to write this piece, and USAID had to ask me to write it because economists working in this area have been actively taught that economics is gender neutral, and that anything that any group experiences by way of inequality is a result of either their own poor choices or their own personal inadequacies. These are habits of thought that are going to require significant pressure from women and their advocates, from policymakers inside of governments and other institutions. We, at this point, have not only data, hard data, but truckloads of data, hard data and otherwise, seriously container ships worth of data that show us that that kind of belief is simply untenable, and that continuing to allow women to be excluded from the economy not only results in lost opportunity, but actively produces some of humanity's worst scourges. So what we need to do in order to get women included better in the economy, including supply chains, is to make it important, is to make it something that is clearly standing toe-to-toe with climate change or any other cause in its essential relationship to global security and human well-being. In doing this, it means that we must begin holding the governments and the international agencies accountable in addition to the businesses. Now, as Sarah pointed out, I have a lot of experience working with major corporations on supply chains and other issues of inclusion. But I have to tell you that I think they certainly need to be held accountable. But I have to tell you that we're into a habit of always turning to the corporations for our solutions, always pointing our fingers at the corporations in terms of blame. And my experience is, especially in working with the corporations, is that many of the barriers that they encounter when they try to include women in their supply chains are things that governments and international agencies not only could solve, but would have to solve, because they're the ones who are in charge. They are the ones who have the authority in that particular domain. And that not holding the governments and the international agencies accountable allows these structural factors that cause women to be excluded above and beyond the stereotypes to continue. Let me give you an example. Most people who work in women's economic empowerment know that the global banking system is one of the biggest culprits in terms of holding women back. It's hard to know exactly what the stats would be for reasons I'll explain in a moment. But the best estimate is probably that women own about 30% of global businesses and get only 5% of conventional business loans from banks. A new study that has recently come out from the World Bank looking at the effect of the pandemic says that actually that number has fallen by half. So if women were given 5% of conventional business loans before the pandemic, they're down to 2.5%. This is something that shows that when the pressure is off, when people are allowed to turn back to the normal way of thinking about and doing businesses, that we fall back into those exclusionary patterns. And yet it's simply the case that that there is very little justification for the banks to behave in this way. I discuss in my book a case study that I did in China with the bank there, where the bank argued that they shouldn't have to include women in their bank, among their customers, that they did not currently have women customers, and in fact, that women never applied to their bank. And so they would tell you all kinds of stuff about how women made bad customers for banks, that they weren't reliable, that they had too much attention to detail and worried too much about interest rates, both of which would normally be a good quality for a client. And in particular, they would say, well, women don't really care about business. They only care about children, and therefore they're bad customers for banks. And this kind of stereotype was used then to justify why they had no women customers. But look more carefully at this. If they have no women customers and women never applied to the bank, that means they had no data on women as customers. They literally did not know what they were talking about. And they were justifying everything they did on the basis of stereotypes. These exclusionary barriers among the banks, therefore, are not just a function of women not having the guts to, pitch up and apply for credit. And they're not just about women not having enough information to apply for credit. They are about the active ignorance and resistance that comes from the banking system. And the only way we're ever going to get around that is if the governments and the international agencies start to get involved. One way we see this involvement recently is a 2018 move on the part of the World Bank to start making their member banks in developing countries report their data broken out by gender. This is going to be slow to happen. It's something that in the developed world, there are actually laws that were enacted in the 1970s that told banks that they could not collect and record their customer data by gender. In the end, what this was intended to keep them from discriminating. In the end, all it did was give them a smokescreen behind which to discriminate against women. So what we need to do is to monitor the banks, is to hold the banks accountable, as well as to stimulate them to do the right thing. Behind the stereotype, though, the other stereotype mentioned about business and children. This is the excuse of childcare is probably the single most frequent excuse given for discriminating against women, no matter whether you're in entrepreneurship or employment, the formal economy, the informal economy. After the pandemic, we should be learning the hard lesson, the very clear lesson that childcare is a form of economic infrastructure that the global economy needs to invest in. It's the same as building airports or building roads. It's the same as building information systems. If roughly 40% of your economy is under a specific limitation of not being able to participate because of childcare, then the obvious thing to do would be to invest in universal, affordable, high-quality childcare. And this problem will not be solved until that gets done. There are several other things that could be done. So, for example, one of the structural problems that women face in growing business is access to markets and access to capital. These things happen, are rooted in longstanding exclusions. So, for example, controlling the mobility of women and making making their mobility unsafe, such that women are not able to go out and conduct business because they're either held at home or the streets are too dangerous for them to do so. So working on access to just public life, access to markets and safety of movement is very important, and that's something only a government can do. Similarly, access to capital is something, women's lesser access to capital is rooted in longstanding rules against their owning the major store of wealth in world history, and that is land. Globally, less than 20% of the world's landholders are female. That means that if banks are using land ownership as a predicate for lending money, which they do, particularly in the developing world, then there have to be ways of created of establishing creditworthiness other than pledging land. And governments and those who manage the banking system would have to step up and do that. That's not just something that some corporation can pull up their pants and do. Very often there's a stereotype about, oh, well, women don't know anything about business, and therefore they shouldn't be doing business. And I often see this used as a basis for cheating women, a rationale for charging them more for supplies or giving them poorer customer terms. This kind of thing, again, is something that could be regulated, and often even where it is against the law to do that is not enforced. One of the places where we see this most obvious is in export and customs. Frequently, I hear the stereotype, well, women just don't care about growth, and therefore that's why they don't export. When actually what is almost certainly what's happening is that women are being cheated at customs, bullied at customs. We know for a fact that government corruption falls more heavily on women than on men. And the evidence that I have seen is that that actually goes double for customs agents, that we're not only seeing extortion, but we're seeing demands for sexual favors. This is something that definitely hits women more than men. And it's actually a fairly simple fix, I think. If you were to appoint an ombudsman at key ports, usually 1 or 2 ports in a developing country, you would be able to go with those women and make sure that women are treated fairly. We see all kinds of other stereotypes that come from the NGO world, for example. When we try to, for example, recently, when the WTO was approached with the declaration to include women better in world trade, we heard a lot of supposedly progressive sources saying, oh no, we shouldn't do this because economic reform only helps the rich. And anyway, women should not be corrupted by engaging with the world economy. This is ignorance and resistance that we need to not put up with as well. It is not the case that economic reform only helps the rich, and those who work in economic development know very well that that the female among the poor are hurt in more distinct ways than men among the poor, and that these things need to be resolved. As long as we're saying that women should be excluded from the economy because they're too pure to be corrupted, we're going along with a very long-standing cultural stereotype globally that says women should not touch money because it's too dirty. This is something we simply cannot continue to say. In the work that I've done over the years with corporations working on this, one thing we all saw was the need for a holistic approach to reform. And this is something that can be done through actually the international trade agreements that the WTO and others try to facilitate. The most prominent example, the one I think is best, and but it's also the one I'm most familiar with, is the one between Canada and Chile, where they make an international trade agreement that where each ensures the other that they're going to not only work on this holistic need for reform that will allow women to participate in world trade, but also that they will guarantee that each other will enforce the laws, the equality laws that they already have on the books to achieve gender equality. So what we need here is we need advocacy. We need advocacy that's not only aimed at business, but is aimed at governments and international agencies. We need to be brave. We need to have courage. We need to not take on blame for this system ourselves. We need to call out bigotry when we see it. We need to volunteer to help efforts that go on around the world trying to better include women in supply chains. If we can't do that, we need to give money to the institutions who do that, including the Cherie Blair Foundation. And we need to look for ways that we as individuals on an everyday basis can help. And I promise you, there is something that everyone can do about this, and we will all gain a better and more peaceful, more secure, more stable, and more equal world society if we do it. Thank you.